Macron gave a big address to the Parliament today, and somebody in the European Parliament used the F word for the first time, and I'll tell you all about the reaction to that and my lunch with the French President a bit later on. Meanwhile, it's been day 2 of intensive debate in the House of Commons about the strikes on Syria, and today, in particular, whether Theresa May should have consulted Parliament first and whether there needs to be a War Powers Act, legislation that would prevent a Prime Minister from taking action without getting a vote in the House of Commons first. Well, following all of this today was LBC's political editor, Theo Usherwood. Good evening, Theo.
A very good evening, Nigel. It was Jeremy Corbyn's turn in the House of Commons to put down a motion demanding that any time a Prime Minister wanted to take military action, whether that be in Syria or anywhere else, that they had to come to Parliament and ask permission of MPs first. Jeremy Corbyn's point was that since 2003 and the war in Iraq, there had been a convention established by Tony Blair and seen through when it came to the last military conflict in Syria, that if Prime Minister wants to take Britain to war, then they have to ask the permission of MPs. Jeremy Corbyn told the House of Commons that he thinks that rather than having a convention, it should be enshrined in law.
The former Prime Minister came to this House to seek authority for military action in Libya in 2011, Syria 2015, and in 2013 sought authorisation for military action in Syria, which the House denied. I'm sorry to say the Prime Minister's decision not to recall Parliament and engage in further military action in Syria last week showed a flagrant disregard for this convention. This was underscored by the Secretary of State for International Development, who said yesterday, and I quote, "Outsourcing that decision to people who do not have the full picture is quite wrong, and I think the convention that was established is very wrong." No, I won't give way at this moment. So it seems the convention established in 2003 and in the Cabinet Manual is being tossed aside as simply being inconvenient. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe it's necessary and urgent that this House has the opportunity to discuss its rights and responsibilities in decisions on UK military intervention.
This today was, Nigel, the second opportunity, well, I should say opportunity, but actually it was a bit of a marathon for Theresa May as she took questions from MPs in the House of Commons. The nub of her argument was very simple. The Prime Minister needed the right to order military action when he or she seems fit.
There are situations, not least major deployments like the Iraq War, where the scale of the military build-up requires the movement of military assets over weeks, and where it is absolutely right and appropriate for Parliament to debate military action in advance. But that does not mean it is always appropriate. It therefore cannot, and I'm going to make some progress, I'm afraid, it therefore cannot and should not be codified into a parliamentary right to debate every possible overseas mission in advance. I will just make a little more progress and then for as the exception makes clear, there are also situations where coming to Parliament in advance would undermine the security of our operations or constrain the ability of our armed forces to act quickly and decisively. In these situations, it is right for the Prime Minister to take the decision and then to be held accountable to Parliament for it.
Now, last week, Nigel, there was widespread disgruntlement on the Conservative backbenches at the prospect that Theresa May might order military action without going to Parliament to ask permission to do so. But Jeremy Corbyn's stance over the last couple of days, trying to make it law, of his apparent willingness to side with Bashar al-Assad's opinion that, well, there are questions about whether chemical weapons in Syria in the first place. That stance has really galvanised the Tory benches. And so when the result came in, announced by the Speaker John Bercow, it was a resounding win for Theresa May.
The ayes to the right, 317. The noes to the left, 256. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock.
Now, the interesting figure in all of that...
Can we assume then, in this case, that quite a lot of Labour MPs didn't vote?
That was, quite a lot didn't vote, and quite a lot voted with the government on this, and that's going to be how it shakes down. Around 40 or so Labour MPs will have voted with the Conservatives, because of course you have to account for that number, that Labour number 256 is actually including members of the SNP and Liberal Democrats as well. It would be much lower if Jeremy Corbyn didn't have their support. So the splits tonight much more in the Labour Party on this issue than within the Conservative Party.
Yeah, lovely. Theo, thank you very much indeed for that full run-through of today. Well, you've heard the arguments, and Jeremy Corbyn, I have to say, arguing very passionately. Mind you, you've got to remember that he does have a bit of history on this. I mean, he's opposed virtually every single war since he's been alive. He is a genuine pacifist. Doesn't make him a bad person. That is his position. I, for my own part, I've been very critical of these strikes in Syria. I'm really not sure what we're trying to achieve. But personally, I think the Prime Minister needs to have the ability to take military action as and when he or she sees fit. They ultimately, of course, will be held to account afterwards by Parliament and ultimately at a general election. In all forms of warfare, in all forms of military action, the most important element is surprise. And you can't get that if you debate and vote on it in Parliament. So tell me what you think. Do you want Parliament or the Prime Minister to decide on military action? If you think the Prime Minister needs to have the powers to do what Theresa May just did, whether or not you agree with the strikes, call me on 0345 6060 973, or maybe you think Parliament should be consulted every single time we embark on fresh military action, in which case text to 84850, or maybe you think we should stay out of all conflicts, in which case tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and watch us on Facebook. We're up and running, and we're live from the European Parliament here in Strasbourg. Let's go to Phil, who is calling from Swansea. Good evening, Phil.
Oh, good evening, Nigel.
Which argument persuaded you, Phil, today?
Well, I think that we should stay out of it, certainly in this case. I pick you up on the point you made just now about being uncertain of what the objectives were. Can I just draw attention to the fact that it's a sort of case of overkill, wasn't it, in the number of missiles that were used in these attacks? And, the number of missiles, I've forgotten the actual figures, but I'm sure...
About 105, Phil, we used. And this time last year, when Trump did it, without us, when Trump did it in April last year, it was about 60. So it was nearly double the numbers we used.
Can I give you the reason which I believe was the reason behind all this excessive force? The reason, I think, was that the objective wasn't simply to disable these facilities. I think the objective was to utterly and totally annihilate them, and along with it, destroy any evidence which might indicate the true purposes of these facilities. In the Damascus one, for example, you had an employee of the site which was devastated, stating that in an interview that the site was used for nothing more sort of sinister than the development of pharmaceuticals. And on the other hand, you have Theresa May saying that it was used for research and development and production and storage of chemical weapons.
Phil, if they were storing chemical weapons in large quantities in these sites that we annihilated, presumably very large amounts of toxic gas or liquid would have gone out into the atmosphere, wouldn't they?
Exactly. And this employee of the site, or ex-employee now, obviously, if he had the remotest sort of belief that Theresa May was telling the truth, he would not have been, given the possibility that there might have been containers damaged, lying around, leaking out.
No, absolutely. Phil, I mean, look, you and I are both pretty sceptical about this action. My big problem is I don't think there's any long-term strategy involved here. And I think when you haven't got a strategy, you tend to get moved around by short-term events. But Phil, even though you and I don't think she should have done it, can I ask you the question we're debating tonight, and indeed that Corbyn sought approval for in Parliament today but didn't get? Should the Prime Minister have that right to take action without first consulting Parliament?
Well, no, definitely not this one, because...
No. You can't... No. You can't pick and choose. Oh, that's a good rocket attack. Oh, I like that rocket attack. I don't like this rocket attack. I mean, there is a principle here, isn't there?
On principle, no. I think that Parliament should be consulted, at least.
Okay. Okay, fine. No, Phil, you've had your say. I've got to move on. Lots of people want to get in on this, but thank you. Phil, very, very sceptical indeed. Alan's calling from Doncaster. Good evening, Alan.
Good evening, Nigel. Of course, the Prime Minister should be able to make that call without going to Parliament. You only have to look to the Security Council of the United Nations. It's toothless. It has been toothless for many, many, many years. Russia has voted down every proposal that the United Nations Security Council wants to pursue recently. And if that's just 6 people round the table, if I've got that right, what would the problems be for the Prime Minister in the House of 200 or more? It's ridiculous. It's not workable. And at the end of the day, she heads the government who has been voted into the power by this country, and her duty is to protect the people.
Yes. Yeah, under the royal prerogative. That's absolutely right. The primary duty, of course, of government is to protect the people and the country. But Phil, so you tell me, sorry, Alan, did you in this particular case think the strikes were right or not?
In principle, I think they were right. They're sending a message not just to the Syrians, but perhaps the terrorists who also make chemical weapons in that area. And of course, we've got our Russian friends who are still denying the Salisbury event. I know we have no proof, but there's no smoke without fire, is there? But so
well, be careful. I mean, we don't always know. And
No,
look,
we don't.
I've always thought the Salisbury thing was a Russian actor. Whether it was a direct order from the Kremlin or not is a separate conversation. But I have to tell you, Alan, I am really worried now that what will happen is ISIS will fire a couple of shells with chlorine into a civilian area and we'll be bombing again. Alan, your position absolutely clear. The Prime Minister needs to have and use, if she needs to, or he needs to, that prerogative power. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show. Jeremy Corbyn has argued today, very passionately in Parliament, that Theresa May should not have launched those missile strikes on Friday night into Saturday morning into Syrian targets without first having a debate and a vote in Parliament. And he wants a War Powers Act to make sure that no Prime Minister in the future would be able to take military action without first getting approval and permission. Please, for the moment, forget about Theresa May. Forget Theresa May is there. It could be another Prime Minister in a few years' time. Hey, it could be Jeremy Corbyn, couldn't it? Mind you, looking at the record, he opposed the Falklands War, which was the year before he came into Parliament. He's opposed pretty much every single conflict since we've been there, although he does say that he didn't object to us sending troops to Sierra Leone back in May 2000. But forget May, forget Corbyn, forget the individuals, forget even about the circumstances of these strikes in Syria and the rights and wrongs of them, because we've debated those over the last few days. I'm talking here about a general principle. Should the Prime Minister, he or she, whoever it may be able to use their prerogative powers to launch military action without first going to Parliament? And I think they need to have that ability, because I really do believe, as somebody that studied a bit of military history over the years, that the element of surprise is absolutely the key factor in all military strikes in terms of whether they're going to be successful or whether they're not. Let's ask Mike in Stoke-on-Trent what he makes of all of this. Good evening, Mike.
Hello, nice to speak to you again, Nigel.
Good to speak to you.
Right. Well, I think there should be a vote by MPs, I'm afraid. I think they should consult with the constituents first. There should be a free vote, not whipped. Because we don't want to think like Iraq, like that cosy relationship Blair had with Bush. We don't want that happening again. Oh, and he got a nice little job afterwards, didn't he? Oh, and Cameron got a nice
peace envoy in the Middle East. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you, Mike, really?
What about that? JP Morgan Bank, come on.
Oh, well, yes. But, I mean, I think for services to the global order, that was probably going to happen anyway, Mike. But right, so you actually think, Mike, that even consulting Parliament's not enough. You think we should go even wider than that?
Yeah, Parliament, yeah.
But you suggested going out to the constituencies.
Yeah, well, the last time I think a lot of people in 2013. I think a lot of MPs knew what their constituents thought. And look at the terrible situation we're in now. They've bombed it and they didn't have proof. They bombed it without. Supposing there were poisons there, those poisons would have been spread all over the place. I thought they're supposed to be saving civilians. And the idea that he's bombing these civilians, why doesn't he bomb civilians in Damascus now? He's not bombing his own civilians. He wouldn't do that. That's ridiculous.
Mike, you do make a very powerful point about 2013, because in 2013, Cameron's government, with Haig as Foreign Secretary, was absolutely hell-bent, if you remember, on supporting the rebels. And we would have given them money and given them arms. And you are right that, in fact, there was a big, big wave of public opposition to this. And I think the MPs felt that they were going to lose votes at the next general election if they'd supported it. So that process did work, didn't it?
Yeah.
It did work in that case, because we had a big public debate about whether we were going to do it or not. But the argument I'm making is there may be times when genuinely in the national interest, the Prime Minister thinks there's a potential dangerous enemy somewhere that need to be taken out. And I'm arguing, Mike, that for a one-off military strike like that, they need to have the ability to act without telling the enemy what we're about to do.
Well, I don't think you can trust these modern prime ministers. They can't be trusted. Wilson could stand up to the Americans. He said no on Vietnam.
He did.
Prime ministers are complete puppets of the United States these days. And by the way, Nigel, just let me get one little thing in here. I've got to be on. Media, I think the media has been absolutely appalling in its warmongering. And by the way, what about this Julia Skripal? Where's she gone? Where is she?
Well, do you know what? It's a very good question, because no one knows where she's gone. She's said to be well. There've been no interviews given. She won't even meet the Russian ambassador. Well, maybe there's a reason for that. No, listen, you pose a very good question, Mike. Mike, I thank you. Chris says, by text, it must be with the Prime Minister, and I have to applaud Johnny Mercer MP, a former military officer, who basically said, you do this, you hamper the armed forces more, and I would add to that you hamper the armed forces, the more you hamper the PM. So Chris feeling strongly. Nigel, I agree that the PM should be able to deploy troops if we as a country are at immediate risk of harm. However, in this instance, the Donald told the Syrians and Russians days in advance that the missiles were coming. I know. On balance, I think she should have sought prior approval. Okay, yeah, well, actually, in this case, she could, of course, have convened Parliament for Friday. There's no reason why that could not have been done. And I do take your point. The Donald did say the missiles are coming and they're, what was it, smart, shiny and new, or something like that. So, yeah, this one was flagged very heavily in advance, which is probably why very few, was it 3 people, were killed or injured as a result of these strikes. Joe feels even more strongly and says, I want the government to remember we have a Ministry of Defence, not attack. Syria was no threat. We should have kept out of it. Yeah, that's back to the previous debate. Let's ask Omar in Stoke Poges. Omar, if you'd been there today in the House of Commons, would you have voted with Jeremy Corbyn on this?
Definitely not. This isn't some sort of social or economic policy. This is national security, the defence of our nation. Countries like Russia are menaces to us. They're menaces to us, world peace, and their neighbour. There are 2 things we can do. Retreat within our borders and argue with ourselves, or we can actually stand up to them and exert our influence and stay a relevant power in today's world.
Yes, we can stay a relevant power, Omar, by intervening militarily, but of course it's quite possible that there are times in life where military intervention could make a situation worse, not better. I mean, I refer you to Libya, which, by the way, was debated by Parliament. Only 12 MPs opposed it, which I found stunning. I mean, Omar, would you agree with me that Libya is worse now than it was back in 2012?
I would agree with you when I say it's worse now. However, there are some cases where military intervention is a necessity, and military intervention also comes with its secrets, which you can't hand out to the public. When the MPs vote on whether to do a strike or not, they won't be able to be informed of all the details, because some of them will be secret. Next, they'll be saying upload the location of secret military bases and submarines to Facebook.
Yeah, no. Omar, I get the point. Secrecy, the element of surprise, these things really matter. It is about national security, and that is the Prime Minister's job. And I'm generally on that side of the argument. Thank you. George is calling from Croydon. Good evening, George.
Hello, Nigel. Yeah, seeing as you just made the point about Libya, I'm going to make a slightly different point. I just want to point out that that every nation and every religion, organised religion, doesn't matter who, what it is or who it is, whatever the institution is throughout history, it appears to me that every one of them is ever so busy looking for evil outside itself. They want to point at something and call it evil, and nobody ever looks at themselves and finds the wickedness therein. Therefore, it strikes me it might be a very good idea if Jeremy Corbyn was made Prime Minister, got rid of all our weapons, because if he did, no one would attack us, because if he said, we want world peace, we're getting rid of everything, who could possibly attack you if you did that? They'd have no pretext for doing it.
Well, somebody that wanted your territory, George. George, that would be madness. If we unilaterally threw away all of our defences in a world like this, knowing what human nature is, I mean, that would be an act of total insanity, surely.
Well, you may be right in a world that's basically run by competing mafias, Nigel. But in the end, that's the only kind of world that's going to survive. Because,
but George,
do we need to go through World War III before we actually get a global disarmament and people actually grow up and stop seeing evil outside themselves and address the evil within? This country here has been right at the forefront of attacking all these Middle Eastern countries for the last 15 years. We are not the good guys, Nigel. I've had enough of it. I'm sick. There's a lot of soldiers in this country who've been over there, have come back and hate their government because they see themselves fighting alongside the Al-Qaeda people who are supposed to be actually fighting, and they don't like it, Nigel. They don't like it one little bit.
No, George, I agree with that. I do agree. I agree with many of the things that you've said. And it's, of course, very convenient for governments all through history to find evil outside and to point the finger in an effort to unite people around the leader. Indeed, you could say that Theresa May has enjoyed a much higher status in Britain and the world since she talked tough on Russia and sent missiles into Syria. It doesn't, of course, always mean that it's the right thing to do. But George, the idea, rather like communism 100 years ago, that we're all, or even European federalism, the idea that somehow, humankind is going to fundamentally change, I'm afraid it's for the birds, but I love the passion of that phone call. Well, in a minute, I'll tell you about an MEP, French MEP, using the F word, and President Macron's reaction. But for now, you're listening to The Nigel Farage Show. So Emmanuel Macron came to the European Parliament here in Strasbourg this morning. I've never seen more police or security. In fact, someone said his motorcade looked about the size of Donald Trump's, which, having seen that in Washington, seems pretty remarkable to me. He spoke actually at some length. He's a passionate pro-EU supporter. He warned us that there seems to be a European civil war going on between liberal democracy and rising authoritarianism. And he thinks those of us that support nation states are the authoritarians, not the other way around. I think he's got it all the wrong way around. But hey, he called for the European Union to have more taxes of its own, to have more money, to have more power. He called for sovereignty and democracy to move to an EU level. All of which is great, and they all cheer. They love him here. They absolutely love him. In fact, he's almost the last hope they've got, because if you look at the elections a few weeks ago in Hungary, 70% of people voted for parties that actually want the nation state to be the important unit, not the European Union. And hey, look at what happened in Italy and elsewhere. But it was all going swimmingly. Now, normally, I would have spoken in this debate as a group leader, but I gave way to a guy called Florian Philippot, who's an MEP, who now leads a small French party, which I guess I'm going to call the French UKIP. And this is what he had to say.
And make sure that French people have their freedom, their choice. I think it's, worth more than some kind of getting together with Brussels, getting together with Berlin. After all, our nations are civilizations. We are brilliant civilizations. Will always be much, much better than any European treaty. So yes, let us leave the European Union. Let us enter into the world. And, Mr. President, if this prospect doesn't please you, well, then I suppose you could always move back to the European Commission, perhaps be recruited by Goldman Sachs or something like that. I think you would just be moving up in the echelon. So long live Frexit and long live Free France.
Frexit, the F word. I'd never, ever heard the F word. I'd never heard Frexit used in the European Parliament. And you may have heard bits of applause there from the people around him. Believe you me, on the other side of the room, there was a lot of booing. And a very angry Macron later on shot back and said, well, if that's how you feel, why are you sitting here at all as an MEP? The kind of thing they used to say to me. After that, there was a lunch. And I went to the lunch and I was introduced to President Macron by the President of the European Parliament. And he said, well, this is Nigel Farage, the enfant terrible of the European Union, to which President Macron said, I know. He speaks very good English. He was very charming and very nice. And lots of people thought that it was really rather funny that we were sitting around the same table, given that we are probably the two completely opposite ends of the political spectrum when it comes to the European Union. It's a point I've made before. Just because you have completely different opinions to someone doesn't mean you actually have to be rude or vile or hate each other. And that actually is how a proper democratic system ought to work. So back to the Corbyn resolution today. It didn't pass, but he really does want a War Powers Act whereby no British Prime Minister could go into fresh military action without first having a debate and a vote. And I just don't think that's practical. I just think the element of surprise is something that a Prime Minister needs to have to defend the national interest. And I'm not cheering for what happened in Syria on Friday night, Saturday morning, but I believe the Prime Minister has to have that power. Gary says, by text, sometimes a rapid definitive response is needed. To bow down before MPs in some cases could be disastrous and a perfect tool for the enemy to defeat us before we even make it to the field. Nigel, if Parliament gets to vote on all military actions, who is held accountable for that action? RE Syria not taking action against a chemical attack would have been ridiculous after Salisbury. Oh, Tim, I don't know. I mean, if we're bombing Syria because of Salisbury, well, maybe she wants to bomb Moscow next. I don't know, although I do, I have to say, rather doubt it. Mike says, the PM was absolutely correct in this instance. Corbyn is totally unfit for purpose. Jake says, it's a waste of money to attack Syria, and it does not benefit Britain at all. Yes, Jake, I'm not debating that. I'm asking you tonight whether you think the Prime Minister should continue to have the prerogative power and the right to take military action without first consulting Parliament. Chris says, when I was 18, I was in favour of unilateral nuclear disarmament. I am now 53 and realise that mankind would just trample all over you for their benefit. It's sad, but it's reality. Well, Chris, that was exactly the argument or debate I was having with George from Croydon before the break. He thinks, chuck it all away. Get rid of the nuclear weapons, get rid of the army. He kind of thought Corbyn might do that if he became Prime Minister. I don't think he would. His own party wouldn't let him. But you're right. Human nature being what it is, we have to have the ability to defend ourselves and the interests of our people. Let's go to Mark in Romford. Good evening, Mark.
Hi, Nigel. I've spoken to you before. It's a shame in many ways you ain't our Prime Minister. It would be absolutely marvellous.
Well, I tell you what, if I was Prime Minister, Mark, and I never will be, I'm sure, but if I was Prime Minister, I wouldn't have joined the Americans in this particular action on Friday night, Saturday morning. I don't think it makes sense to have done it, but if I was Prime Minister, Mark, I would want the ability to be able to do something like this, and I think if I was to have to go to Parliament, that would completely remove any element of surprise or effectiveness in a military action I wanted to take.
Absolutely. I'm ex-British Forces, served 17 years faithfully, and all I know is the government should reserve the right to take action, limited action, if it's in the immediate national interest to achieve the element of surprise. And I will say one thing, Nigel, on a personal note: there is no way I want that. There is no way I want that Muppet Corbyn in power. With us having to divulge our military strategy before we go into a battle, you might as well shoot your own men yourself.
You called him a Muppet, and Boris Johnson called him a mugwump, so there are lots of words. Yeah, so is it because you see Corbyn as a pacifist? Is that the problem?
No, he's a man of conviction in that respect, and I respect him for it, but he's not living in the real world, and unfortunately, that man has a deep malignancy of everything which is Western, in my eyes, and in some respects, I see him as an enemy within. But that's just my personal opinion.
Doesn't look like you're going to be supporting him next time round, Mark. A very, very strongly put point of view. Mark, thank you very much indeed. Monesh is calling from Southall, a new caller to this show. Good evening.
Hello, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. Right, so now put yourself in the position. You're there. You're an MP in Parliament. You had to vote today on this resolution. Which way would you have gone?
Never in favour of positive action. We've been through this before. What's going on in this country? We've got homeless people here. We've got our own problems. What are we doing interfering with the outside people? and that's our country. What the hell? Where have we not learned from before? Nigel, you tell me.
Let me say that another one of the reasons why I was against this strike is we never seem to learn the lesson. That time and again we interfere in the Middle East and we make things worse, not better, and we never seem to learn. So on the basis, on the argument of this particular action, I don't support it. But Monesh, what I do support is the Prime Minister having that ability, because I do think, a different circumstance, a different Prime Minister, something 5 or 10 years hence that you and I can't even begin to imagine right now, I do think a Prime Minister needs to have that ability.
Nigel, you are an ex-politician, and you've been there before, and you can understand, you're talking a politician's view. She just wants to prove a point that she's got nothing else to do in this world apart from prove something and create some popularity. This is what the propaganda is about. She has got no right to do this, no right whatsoever. And would you, under normal circumstances, do this if you were a politician and not adding your brownie points of what you're going to achieve by it? Would you, if you were in her shoes, what would you do? Tell me.
Well, I mean, what she's done, I think, with what she said over Russia, expelling diplomats, getting other countries to join her, and now this, what she's done is she looks like a much stronger woman than she looked like at the end of February. So, in political terms, I suppose it's done her a lot of good.
And it's going to do her more good, but in political terms, it didn't do you any favours. If you were in power, what would you do? Is this your strategy, your marketing strategy, just to create brownie points? That's not the way to win elections. I didn't like Brexit, for example, but you were a part of that, so I don't want to disregard you. I like you as a human being. I like you as a human being. I don't like you as a politician. Sorry to say that.
That's all right. No, but Monesh, it's a free country. It's a free country, and we're here on LBC to have these debates, and we can disagree fundamentally with each other, but we don't need to hate each other. Monesh, I thank you very much indeed for your call. Call us again sometime soon. Jennifer says, hello, Nigel. Only someone in number 10 with a genuinely massive majority should have the right to make that judgment, not doing everything America tells her to do. No, Jennifer, I'm sorry, you've got this wrong. You've completely misunderstood this. Mrs. May was emphatic yesterday. She told us we did not just follow the Americans. She did this of her own free will. She would have done it even if Donald Trump hadn't been there. And if you want to believe that, you can. But it's a load of hooey, is it not? Tim says, hi, Nigel. If Parliament gets to vote on all military actions, who is going to be held ultimately accountable? Michael says, it's an ideal situation to have the backing of Parliament, so it should be attempted whenever possible, but no, it shouldn't be a requirement. I think that's right, Michael. Our democracy is slow and bureaucratic at the best of times. Can you imagine trying to get an agreement during a time of war? And Michael, I'm absolutely with you. It is an ideal situation. Sort of a precedent was set from 2003 onwards, but I think any idea of that precedent's now been broken because Corbyn lost that vote today. In a moment, I'll tell you about Mrs. May's day. We've talked about Mr. Corbyn's. Well, Jeremy Corbyn lost that vote today in the House of Commons. He wanted a War Powers Act that meant no Prime Minister could engage in fresh military action without first a debate and a vote in Parliament. And even though I disagree with what happened in Syria over the weekend, I believe the Prime Minister needs those powers. That's what I'm asking you. Would you put yourself in a position? You're there today in the House of Commons. Would you have backed Corbyn or would you not? And the only reason Corbyn didn't win was because a substantial number of his own MPs either voted with the government or chose to abstain. Meanwhile, it is massive Commonwealth Summit weeks. First time in 10 years the Commonwealth has met here well, not here, I'm in Strasbourg actually, but in London, and Theresa May's been busy because you'll have noticed there's this big row over the Windrush generation. It turns out that particularly children of people who came here between 1948 and 1971, that in many cases they didn't apply for full citizenship, and what's happened is the Home Office appear to have destroyed many of the original boarding passes and pieces of documentation. So there were people who lived here, in some cases, for nearly 70 years, who were at risk of being deported. So it has been a very embarrassing story to come out during the course of this big Commonwealth week. And so May's apologised to Caribbean leaders over this, saying she's genuinely sorry about the anxiety that's been caused and how much she valued the contribution that Commonwealth citizens, particularly those from the Caribbean, had made to this country. Let's listen to what she had to say.
And I want to dispel any impression that my government is in some sense clamping down on Commonwealth citizens, particularly those in the Caribbean who built a life here. I take this issue very seriously. The Home Secretary apologised to the House of Commons yesterday for any anxiety caused, and I want to apologise to you today because we are genuinely sorry for any anxiety that has been caused.
Well, we're good at being sorry because she also, later on in the day, said that she deeply regrets the criminalisation of same-sex relations in former British colonies, saying, "We were wrong then and we're wrong now." And speaking at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, she said the UK would support any Commonwealth nation seeking to reform outdated legislation. "I'm all too aware that these laws were often put in place by my own country," said Mrs May. "I deeply regret the fact that such laws were introduced and that the legacy of discrimination, violence and death that still persists today." And of course some of these countries still do have the death penalty. I don't know about you, but I think we really have got to stop apologising for the past, apologising for different social and moral values that people held back then. I mean, what next? You're going to apologise for tiger shooting? I mean, I have no idea where this actually ends. And I wonder, I mean, in the European Union, effectively, member states are told what they can and can't do. They have to sign up to the European Convention on Human Rights. Is Mrs May trying to politicise the Commonwealth? Is it a club that could develop into one of close relations and trade? Or is she trying to turn it into some kind of union where we've all got the same rules? And whatever you think, you may well think that it's quite wrong that countries have the death penalty. You may well think it's quite wrong that countries, oppose gay marriage legally. But is it really the Prime Minister's place to apologise for all of this? I'm not so sure that it is. However, Blair started this and we just go on apologising for virtually everything. Back to the Prime Minister, back to prerogative powers, back to should he or she in the future, regardless whether it's Mrs May or Mr Corbyn or anybody, should they have to go to Parliament first? I'm going to ask Barbara in Chichester to answer that for me. Good evening.
Oh, good evening, Nigel. I think that she should have the powers, the Prime Minister should have the powers when it's a matter of security, when it's something that is time restricted as well.
Yeah.
I think that even although you disagree, I mean, I personally as well disagree, but I feel that she must. I must assume that she has all the information that I don't have. So I just feel that definitely she should have had the powers to do it.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a talking shop, and some of the things that people come out with in Parliament, some of the MPs, I think, goodness, it would just waste so much time.
Well, we could. I mean, she could, if she'd chosen to, have called Parliament on Friday to meet, have a one-day debate and a vote. She could have done that, and that would not have wasted a tremendous amount of time. So there is an argument that says that it's wholly possible to do. But what I'm saying, Barbara, is there are circumstances in which clearly the Prime Minister may need to use the element of surprise in our interests.
Yes, at certain times.
So you think it's a good thing that Corbyn did not win that vote today?
Oh, yeah, well, of course, yes.
Okay, very good. Barbara, thank you very much. Thanks for hanging on. I know she's been waiting for ages. I know lots of you patiently wait for ages. I do try and get through as many of you as I possibly can. Clive is calling from Fife. Good evening, Clive.
Hello, Farage. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing fine. I don't know your surname, so I'll call you Clive.
Yeah, well, that would be nice. You call everybody else like Nicola Sturgeon, Jeremy Corbyn, Tony Blair. It's always Blair, Sturgeon, Corbyn. Why can't you just have some manners and call them with the actual name, like you do with Theresa May? Anyway.
What you mean, the Right Honourable? I mean, using that. So what I should say, is the Right Honourable so and so list their academic qualifications. I think surnames for leaders work, Clive, don't you?
Just have a bit of respect. Common courtesy is what's required. Anyway, Nigel.
Do you mean the same kind of courtesy and respect they've shown me over the years?
Nigel, you've probably got exactly what he deserved.
Oh, I see. Oh, I get it. So they can be abusive to me, but in return, I have to use their full titles, Christian names, and surnames.
Nigel, you're not an MP. You don't represent them anymore. Yeah, I don't know what you do actually. But anyway,
well, actually, Clive, I'm sorry to really... I'm going to try and ruin your evening, because you're trying to ruin mine, so let's have some fun with this. Actually, I'm sitting here, Clive, in the European Parliament, as the leader of the biggest group from the United Kingdom, because we won the European elections back in 2014. So how's about that, then?
Yeah, sitting there just ready to lift your pension for an organisation you completely detest and want to get rid of.
Just like the SNP. Just like the SNP, Clive, who've been going to Westminster, and Alex Salmond's going to have, 30 years of pension? That's kind of how it works. Anyway, Clive, let's move on, because otherwise people might get bored with our spat. Do you think, that, had you sat there today, would you have supported Corbyn on his proposal?
I would have supported Jeremy Corbyn, yes. I think if we have been attacked directly, we should retaliate, then discuss it later. We've not been attacked by anybody that anybody can prove anything against, that we stand up in a court of law. Nobody's attacked Britain, nobody's attacked the UK, nobody's attacked Europe from Syria or Russia.
No.
Prove it. Now we are sending our troops, spending our money that could be spent on saving the NHS, protecting the troops that are sleeping rough because the country doesn't care about them. We are spending that money attacking an ancient, proud, sovereign nation, the cradle of humanity, if you like, Babylon, blah, 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 because we need to keep cushy with Donald Trump, because we're so desperate for trade deals that we're not going to get after the disaster that is Brexit.
Oh, right.
So show me one shred of proof that the Russians done anything in Salisbury. Show me one shred of proof that there's been a chemical attack in Eastern Ghouta. Show me.
Okay, no, Clive, believe you me, your scepticism is not alone. Thank you so much for your phone call. It was an absolute delight, nearly all of it. Anna is calling from Tooting, and she's a new caller to the programme. Good evening, Anna.
Good evening, Nigel. It's lovely to speak to you.
Oh, gosh, you're a bit politer than Clive was, but there we are. So,
well, it makes the world go round to be...
I think he just rang for a punch-up, didn't he, really? But, hey, So, Anna, come on. You were sitting in... Imagine you were in Parliament today.
Or something. Yeah, I'd like to say, Nigel, I support Mrs May entirely in what she did.
Yep.
And I think, amongst all the men, she's the most man of the lot. And I think she showed great courage. And she must have had to think about it very, very hard. I don't think she did this lightly at all. And I think we should all come together for the sake of the country and not have stupid little fisticuffs all the time.
So when she said she wasn't just following the Americans, you believe her, yeah?
I think she's a very courageous woman, and I believe she really thought about it very hard before she ever did that at all, considering what happened with the past.
And do you think, Anna, that a Prime Minister needs to have that prerogative power to take action if he or she sees fit?
I think in extreme cases, and this is one of them, where chemical weapons are being used, and it was used here in England a couple of times, and I think she's probably privy to other information we're not.
All right, well, she may be. Anna, listen, I thank you, and Anna there, fully supportive of the Prime Minister's actions and her right to take them. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show exclusively on LBC.